Right, so I've had this idea for quite some time now, and I've been reluctant to make this video because I wasn't sure what the best way would be to explain this idea. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've thought about life and people in general, I've come to realize something, and that is, life is essentially, it's a war of people who have different perspectives of reality. That is, life is a war of different realities. So what do I mean by this? Well, because of the fact that we're all different, we all have a unique perspective of what life means, owing to the fact that we're all born differently, we have different personalities, and a lot of psychological research has shown that your personality is largely influenced by genetic factors and early upbringing, neither of which you have much of a control over, compounded with the fact that our life experiences are also unique. And in addition to that, because of the fact that our views on literally everything, not just our personalities, but our views on the world, on how mankind should be, how mankind should behave, what is good and what is moral, a lot of this is particular to each individual. So everyone's perception of reality is different. And this is something that we often don't give much thought about, because everyone's perception of reality is different. And this is what I mean when I say that life is a war of different realities, because this is something that matters in the specific context of where people who are seeking advice, people who want to know things like what they ought to do and how people should behave, fail to take into account the fact that we are all different, and what one person believes, or what one person believes is the truth, is not shared universally by another person, by everyone else. So I think I phrased that awfully clumsily, but essentially, life is like this. We each have a unique perspective on ourselves and on the nature of reality. And this means that whenever we try giving advice to other people, we're often blind to one another's differences, and we have a tendency to universally presume that everyone else thinks like us. This is where things get complicated, and where the concept of life being a war of different reality comes in. And what inspired me, what drove me to realize this is, I remember once I was watching a clip of Tucker Carlson's podcast on the internet, on Twitter, by the way. This was quite some time ago. I think it might have been last year. And I remembered watching this episode where Tucker Carlson was answering questions and answers. He was doing Q&As from his audience. There was an individual who submitted to him a letter saying that somebody in his family, was it his family or was it a personal friend, was a leftist who had very different viewpoints, and they they believed that he had done something to offend them. So he was asking, should I apologize? And Tucker Carlson said, you should, because by apologizing, I'm paraphrasing, but these are basically his words. By apologizing, you relieve yourself of the obligation. And he said this regardless of whether or not the individual in question had done anything wrong. So I remember being awfully struck by that, thinking, oh, really? So by apologizing, you relieve yourself of any obligation, and that's it? But I thought about that. It stuck with me for quite a while, and I realized I didn't agree with it. And I couldn't quite understand how Tucker Carlson could come to that conclusion. Because a thing that I consider very important, when you apologize for a wrong that you've done, the important thing is that you know that you're in the wrong. And that's where the apology ought to come from. Because an apology, this is my view on the matter. When you apologize to people, it shouldn't be out of pressure. It shouldn't be done because you feel you're expected to, but if you're not genuinely sorry, it should be done because you feel that you've done wrong and you want to make amends for what you've done. But in the context that Tucker's in the context of the question from the viewer, the submission from Tucker's viewer that he was talking about, the situation was a little different. And what Tucker was essentially saying was something that I found rather strange. It's that you should apologize anyway, even if you're not actually sorry, even if you feel like you're being asked to, you feel like you're being pressured to. So I couldn't really come round to Tucker's way of thinking. But I thought about it a little more, and I realized, well, why would Tucker believe something like that? What kind of person do you have to be that you would apologize in such a given circumstance? By the way, I apologize if what I'm saying sounds clumsy, and like if I'm not making any, like if I haven't described this situation very carefully, because I'm sort of paraphrasing what he said. But anyway, Tucker Carlson and I, we have very different views on the matter. But anyway, what kind of person is Tucker Carlson that he would have such a viewpoint on a situation like that? Well, Tucker Carlson is an award-winning journalist, and he's arguably one of the most influential figures in certainly on the internet. I mean, he's far more influential and famous now that he's no longer working for Fox News. I mean, he got a lot of prime viewers when he was on primetime TV on Fox News, but now that ever since he's gone solo as a journalist, I don't know exactly how many, but his his viewing figures have reached tens of millions. He's one of the only Western journalists, as far as I'm aware, who's secured an interview with Vladimir Putin and the president of Iran. So he's a big deal. He's a big fish, Tucker Carlson. He's very successful. And the fact that he's successful, the fact that he is a man who rakes in 7 or 8 figures worth of viewers, the fact that he comes from a very privileged upbringing, and that he's a somebody, I feel that this has colored his view on how to react in those given situations. Because there's a psychological sense of serenity that comes with with being very intelligent and being very upwardly mobile, and, well, think about the traits that one would need in order to reach the level of success that Tucker Carlson has. You'd have to, obviously, you'd have to have an IQ in the upper quartile, 130 to 145, and you'd have to have a very high general factor of personality. You'd have to be very agreeable to work with, but also you'd have to be, well, you'd have to be the kind of individual who wouldn't be burdened and encumbered by conflicted feelings in a situation like the one I just described. Like, for instance, why should I be made to apologize in that situation if I didn't do anything wrong? If I feel like I didn't do anything wrong, I feel like I'm being expected to. So obviously I feel awfully different, but Tucker sees it a lot differently. In the situation I described earlier, Tucker doesn't really take these kinds of social anxieties very seriously. And those kinds of people, I don't know whether it's causation or correlation, but they tend to rise up to positions of power, like bubbles. And that's what got me thinking. That is basically what led me down the pathway of thinking that life is, a lot of the times, it's a conflict. It's sort of like a battleground for different ideas and different life strategies. Because every single person who volunteers advice, who gives advice to other people, does so with lessons and with lessons and experience, with lessons in life based on their own experience, which they implicitly presume is part of the universal shared experience. That's the thing we do, because whenever we give advice to other people, we do so without really being aware of how different another person is to us. And we believe that if they act and behave in the same manner that we do when we're giving advice, that their lives will turn out better. And that is true most of the times. I mean, I'm not saying that most people, when they give advice, don't give transferable advice and expert guidance in how to act in certain given situations. But there are times where I believe it's where it's not possible, where a person gives advice that is probably, it may work for them in that given situation, but that is actually inappropriate in others. But this is something that we're innately blind to, because we fail to accept. And I'm not being a moral relativist here. I'm not trying to argue that even though different things, different actions are right or wrong in different contexts, but I'm saying that we are the different context when we give advice without being aware of who we're giving it to and who is on the receiving end of it. Because of the fact that we're all different. We all have a unique individual perspective on what it means to be human and what it means to be a good person and a bad person, and what's the right and the wrong thing to do. This ties in with, I mentioned ages ago, back on my other channel, I mentioned that Rudyard Lynch, what a Voltist, an historian, a content creator on YouTube, he said something that really struck with me in one of his videos. He said that all forms of ideology are rationalization based on your thoughts, feelings, and experience. And that makes perfect sense, because different kinds of people are attracted to different ideologies. And an ideology is a framework with which we try and map out and make sense of the world and morality and the human experience. it is known. This is something that research has borne out. We know that different individuals are attracted to different political ideas. What kinds of people are most likely to be Nazis, National Socialists? Well, these people are essentially psychopaths, people with people who yearn for confrontation, people who are low in agreeableness, people who are attracted to dangerous and subversive ideas, even in spite of the clear social risk that comes with adoption of these beliefs and what can happen to, because it's not safe to be a National Socialist. You know, in a lot of countries, the police will probably go knocking on your door. You'll almost certainly never find a steady job, certainly if you're not an open believer in Nazism. And if you're the kind of person who's politically motivated, I'm talking about, you know, the Richard Spencer types, maybe even Nick Fuentes. Actually, well, I don't know. I'm not saying that Nick Fuentes and Richard Spencer are Nazis, but well, they've been very critical about certain tenets of liberalism, and like the Holocaust, and they've talked a great deal about the influence that Israel and international Jewry has on political discussion. And that kind of makes you a target in this day and age, because there are lots of things that you're just not allowed to talk about. So it begs the question, what kind of person is most attracted to beliefs and ideas like that? In reality, it's not just the psychopaths who are attracted to that. There's also people who have an almost narrow, single-minded commitment to speaking the truth, even if it comes at the expense of making friends with other people. So if you believe that the truth is more important than getting other people to like you, then you're another person who may or may not be attracted to subversive ideologies, or ideologies which I consider unsafe. And by the way, I'm not insinuating any of the people I mentioned are Nazis. I'm doing the same thing that leftists do, where I conflate ideologies like, for instance, being an extreme nationalist, being extremely patriotic and nationalistic, and having views that are regarded as authoritarian or extreme by some. But in the eyes of a lot of people, there's very little difference between being a fascist, being a Nazi, and just being very right-wing. I mean, we saw this with the Mehdi Hassan versus 20 far-right activists video on Jubilee that I talked about a couple minutes ago. But the principle still applies, you know. Who is attracted to those kinds of worldviews? What kind of individual holds that sort of Weltanschauung? It's, well, as I mentioned, the psychopaths and maybe the autists, I guess. And what kind of person is most likely to be a leftist? Or what kind of person is most likely to be a feminist or an LGBT activist? Well, usually you can tell them, you can infer as much by their appearance. These are mentally unstable people who are high in neuroticism, who most likely come from broken homes or complicated early childhoods. These people have tattoos, they have septum rings, and freakishly bright or unnaturally colored hair. And these people are dysfunctional for the most part. And their ideology is a logical extension of their neuroses, the various neuroses and mental illnesses that they have. And if you're the kind of person who has had to contend with life experiences like that, what feelings of being abandoned, betrayed, or feeling afraid that the world is out to get you, then it is natural that you will gravitate towards a belief system that will that can be a belief system that revolves around policing other people's tone of speech, a belief system that is intellectually dishonest, because you have to be quite brave, you have to be quite resilient in order to face the truth. And there's really only certain kinds of people can psychologically come to terms with the truth if the truth is unsettling and frightening. And this links with what I was saying earlier about why single narrow-minded people, possibly with autism, are most likely to become activists on the far right, and the psychopaths who are most likely to be on the extreme right. Similarly, those who are dysfunctional and the ones who clearly have a litany of mental illnesses are most likely to be left-wing. And logically, and as a logical extension, as a corollary from this, the kinds of advice that they will give to other people, things like be kind, be respectful, be tolerant to others, and this is unqualified respect and tolerance to people, even if they are disreputable or just plain nasty pieces of work, based purely on their identity, arbitrary things like that, ideologies that don't really hold up to any kind of moral scrutiny. Well, that's the kind of thing you would expect leftists to be like. That's what you would expect to see when dealing with the psychology of a leftist. And also, what kinds of people are most likely to be libertarians? Well, in my experience, I think usually there tend to be two kinds of people who become libertarians. I mean, on the one hand, there's idealistic young men who are on the cusp of adulthood, in their late teens or early 20s, who have very little world experience. I was one of them, who have very little engagement with the real world, but are very intelligent and avid consumers of books like Atlas Shrugged or Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. And these people are most likely to be attracted to the appeal that classical liberalism and free market libertarianism has, because a lot of the problems that we're facing now could theoretically be resolved by the ideological principles of liberalism. But anyway, I could make a whole separate video on that. Anyway, the first kinds of people who are most likely to be libertarians are idealistic young men. Usually it's men. Sometimes it can be women, but it's normally young men. And then also there's big business owners. Obviously, big business owners, rich people, are attracted to liberalism, to libertarianism, because they make a lot of money and they don't want their taxes to be too high. So that's another thing. Another thing I didn't think about is this. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the differences between the rich, the very rich, and the people who are not rich. They have totally different, almost diametrically opposing viewpoints. Rich people, in general, they tend to view human capital as more disposable than normal people. Rich people, they relish in the idea of working, not just working hard, but working in principle, because to them everything is a means to an end. All the ultra rich and the wealthy people got there by working hard, and if everyone just worked hard, then they could attain the same level of wealth and social status that they could. And so it follows that the ideological belief systems that they have and the advice that they give to others stems as a logical corollary from that. So that's why you see rich people, like those in like any video by Prager University, to be honest, they will talk about the benefits of immigration. They'll talk about immigration as though it's a net good. They'll talk about personal responsibility. So they'll talk about things like personal responsibility. They think personal responsibility is spiritually and morally fulfilling. They believe no matter what life throws at you, you have to just suck it up and deal with it. And the world should exist in accordance with this belief. So there should be a limited government that doesn't really interfere in human affairs. Everyone should be left to their own devices. And don't complain, basically, because complaining is for weak people and losers. This is why a lot of the ultra-rich people tend to be libertarians. It's not an accident. You don't often tend to see rich people who are socialists. I mean, there is Gary Stevenson, but to be honest, I think he's worthy of an entirely different video. And he's the exception. He's not the rule. Most rich people want lesser taxes. Most rich people, at least in their view, they tend to believe their vast fortunes, they see it as a result of their hard work and their constructive attitude. And the advice that you see them give stems from their own life experiences. So they expect others, they sort of demand other people to adopt the same kind of materialist attitude and mindset, the cold and ruthless pragmatic mindset that they have, because it will help them succeed and thrive in life. But they don't see their having acquired all this wealth as a result of opportunity as well as hard work. And they don't take into account the many untold millions of people who work incredibly hard but who are not rich. Or they fail to see the flaws in the system, or if they do, they only see the flaws in the system insofar as that the system doesn't permit them to make as much money or expand their franchise as much as they want to. And the advice that you see them give, I talked about this earlier, the advice you see them give revolves very much around the theme of personal responsibility. The government should take a hands-off approach in dealing with personal matters and policing people, and yeah, basically stuff like that. And obviously, it goes without saying that people who are poorer tend to be more likely to be socialists, and because people who are in the economic, let's call them precariat classes, who are lower class, are more vulnerable to the whims of the economy, and the advice that they would give are often rooted in humility and things like showing compassion for other people when they're struggling. And that's another thing. Rich people, this is not true of all rich people, but it is certainly true of some of them. Rich people don't really, because rich people have little to no personal experience in dealing with people who are destitute, they tend to view people who are economically destitute as victims of their own poor choices, because they see every life outcome as a result of the choices you make. You know, a common refrain I often hear rich people say is, you get nothing out of life other than what you put into it. But this is a view that you see more often with people who are rich, and less so with the poor. And that explains why poor people are more likely to be socialists and why rich people are more likely to be capitalists. I mean, go figure. It seems like common sense. But also, another thing that we don't often think about is their attitude to life and how we ought to go about our lives and how we should treat other people is another. It's another thing that which we never think much about, but it's also an attitude and mindset that stems from their life experiences and their ideological outlook on the world and their personality. So that's another thing to think about. There's a YouTuber called British Lander. You may or may not have seen his videos because he regularly posts video blogs about the state of the UK and what's going on while he's walking around in the field with his dog. And I bumped into him by accident on Discord. We just so happened to be in the same server, and we got chatting in DMs, and we ended up having an argument over something. It was quite amusing and interesting. We were talking about the situation regarding the migrant protests in Epping, in Essex, which has been a hot topic in the news lately. We were arguing over this specific minor detail where I claimed, I believed at the time, that the leftist protesters were being bussed in. And this is something that the chief of police, the Essex chief of police, was being grilled over, and he claimed we did not bus in these protesters. And I was so certain that they were, even though I hadn't actually seen the video footage. But it turns out that was factually incorrect. That the protesters at Epping, they were not literally ferried, they were not shuttled to the location via bus. What happened was they had arrived at the train station and then they were marshaled over closer to the hotel by the police who were protecting them, which is not the same thing as saying that they were bussed over. And British Lander, he pointed this out to me. Even though it's a really minor and inconsequential difference, it's not really a meaningful distinction anyone would care to make. Because, like, what is the difference between you know, acting as a marshal and marshalling and being a steward and escorting somebody to a location by foot? It's especially when you consider that they were bussed out of the area because the situation was getting a bit rowdy. The protesters were getting angry with them, which, you know, understandable considering they were basically there to defend the rights of foreign pedophiles. Anyway, but they were being bussed out of the area, but they weren't being bussed in. And this is what we were arguing about a while ago. And as the argument was going on, I was thinking, why are we having this argument? I mean, it's such a minor detail. Like, does this even matter? But Landier, he would not let this go. He would not drop it. This was, to him, the truth of what actually happened. The facts were more important than than the principle of, well, letting other people be wrong, but to him it was more important to get the truth out than it was to live and let live. And that was essentially, that's the difference between him and me. We had different views on the same situation. In my experience, based on my personality and the way I see the world, this kind of thing, I would have just let it go. Because if I'm in a social situation where somebody says something that I know is factually inaccurate, but I want them to like me, and, you know, people might agree or disagree with this. Not everyone is the same, but in my experience, I tend to prefer to let them be wrong, especially if it's a minor detail that no one really cares about in the grand scheme of things, because I want people to like me. You know, I don't like putting myself in adversarial or antagonistic positions towards other people, especially unless if it's in very specific circumstances, unless if it's, you know, unless if there's if I consider there to be a good reason for it. If it's something that I can't let go. But obviously, in the case of British Langer, he was different. He saw it differently. This was not something that he would just let slide. It made me think about what would happen if we actually met up and at a pub or location together. We would probably be. He would have probably argued with this until I would have given up and conceded that he was right, which, by the way, is what happened. And I really enjoyed talking with him. I enjoyed hearing his perspective, and I'm glad. I felt humbled because he'd showed me actual footage of the protests on YouTube, and he was right that the protesters were not being bussed in the area. That was the sort of the verbal technicality through which the slimy chief of Essex Police was able to safely make the point that yes, the protesters were not being bussed in, even though the reality is so trivially different. And even though the reality, well, that there's such a trivial difference between what actually happened and how he put it, that no one really cares about it. None of the supporters of the protesters who turned up that day. It's nothing that we're just splitting hairs. But this was not a trivial difference to him. And there are many other people who think just like that, because again, this all relates to what I was talking about at the very start of this video. We're all different. We all have different perspectives on what is right and what is wrong in any given situation. And nowhere are these differences in how we operate more apparent than in the realm of whenever we try giving advice to other people. Because again, we give advice to others. We give generalized advice, which is based on our own lived individual experience. But we are, at the same time, we're blind to how effective our individualized perception of reality can be to others, because we fail to take into account how different everyone else is. That's not to say that our advice isn't always effective. It certainly can be effective for most people, although I think it also sort of depends on who is listening. But I guess what I want to wrap this video up with is, what I want to say is this, essentially. If you're watching a video on YouTube by somebody who you personally admire, by somebody you look up to, and you listen to advice that they give, you should take a moment to consider, this may work for him or her, but does this work? Will this work for me? Is that person in a position to know what I'm like and whether this would work in my case? And by the way, I would even say the same thing. I don't have a lot of viewers on this channel. I think I've only got something like 60 subscribers. But I wonder if there are any people, any viewers of my channel who have seen the videos I've made and wondered, will this work for me, or do I agree with this? And yes, my point is exactly that. Don't take everything that I say at face value. Question even the things that I say to you. What you should do, you should cross-reference them with your own life and think, is this applicable in my case? Because only you can be in a position to know what is right and what is wrong in your case. I don't necessarily believe what I'm saying is the same as moral relativism, because as far as I'm concerned, moral relativism, it's a belief, it's a compartment, it's a belief that it's a compartmentalized belief system where you believe that across different societies and in different contexts, different things are right or wrong. Like, if you're a moral relativist, you believe that Sharia law should be well, an accepted legal framework and well, accepted legal system in parts of London that are majority Muslim or Pakistani. You know, well, obviously, that's not the kind of person I am. I'm not one of those moral relativists, and I believe moral relativists, the people who unironically believe this, are cowards, in my personal opinion. And as a general principle of life, what I would wrap this video up with, as a general pointer for anyone watching this, I would say, before you take advice from other people, or while you're taking advice from other people, if you seek advice from other people, you should take a moment to think about who the person is that's giving the advice, and you should also take a moment to think about your own life history, and you should think, will this work for me? Have I tried this before in the past, and did it work back then? Because we tend to make assumptions. I'm especially guilty of this, by the way. When we're listening to advice from other people, we sometimes have a tendency to value other people's experiences above our own. And that's the thing. We sometimes reject the primacy of our own experiences. This is something I remember hearing about in a lecture by Terence McKenna. And I wouldn't say, I'm not a huge fan of Terence McKenna. I mean, for the most part, I could probably give my views on psychedelics in a different video, but I thought for the most part, some of the videos that I saw him, to me, he sounded like a whacked out nut. But it was very interesting, the thing he said about the primacy of human experiences. I think we should value our own lived experience more than anything else. I mean, we should value it more than, certainly more than the received wisdom of society, more than things which scientists have verified with evidence, because the scientists may have verified the truth with their own experience, but we haven't. We're not in a position to know if their results are accurate or reliable. So that's why you should always look to your own experience. And in the same way that we can't know what is actually true, we had to take the words of experts and professionals in the context of science and learning more about the world. So we should do the same when it comes to general life advice and wisdom. Because again, life is a war of different realities. We are all irreconcilably different. We all have different views, all derived from the fact that we're innately different as individuals. We have different personality traits. We have different life experiences. So we should be mindful of that when we give advice and when we're taking it. Anyway, that's I hope you were able to understand that and take stock of some of the things I said. This has been Tracking. I hope you guys have a lovely day. Take care, everyone.